November 1930. The frozen wilderness of northern Canada. A fur trapper arrives at a remote Inuit village he's visited many times before. But this time, something is wrong. The village is completely silent. Fire still smoldering in the stoves, food left on tables, rifles abandoned by the doors, and every single person, men, women, children, gone. Not a footprint, not a struggle, not a sound. 30 people vanished into thin air. This is the mystery of Anjikuni Lake. Joe LaBelle was an experienced fur trapper who had spent decades navigating the brutal wilderness of northern Canada. In November 1930, he was making his regular circuit through the Nunavut territory, checking his trap lines and trading with the Inuit communities scattered across the tundra. He had visited the village near Anjikuni Lake many times before. It was a small settlement, home to roughly 30 Inuit people who lived in traditional dwellings and survived by hunting, fishing, and trapping. The village was remote, hundreds of miles from the nearest town, accessible only by dog sled or on foot. In winter, it was completely isolated, cut off from the outside world by snow, ice, and temperatures that could drop to 40 below zero. As LaBelle approached the village that cold November evening, he expected to see the usual signs of life. Smoke rising from chimneys, dogs barking, children playing, the sound of voices carrying across the frozen lake. The Inuit were known for their hospitality, and LaBelle had always been welcomed warmly. He looked forward to a hot meal, shelter from the cold, and news from the community. But as he got closer, he realized something was terribly wrong. The village was silent, completely unnaturally silent. No dogs barking, no voices, no movement. Just an eerie, oppressive quiet that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. LaBelle called out. His voice echoed across the frozen landscape. No response. He entered the village cautiously, his rifle ready. What he found defied all logic and explanation. The dwellings, a mix of traditional igloos and small wooden structures, were all intact. Fire still burned in some of the stoves, though they had burned down to embers. Pots of food sat on tables, the meals half eaten, as if the villagers had been interrupted mid-dinner and simply walked away. Rifles leaned against doorways. An Inuit hunter would never abandon his rifle. It was his lifeline in the wilderness, essential for hunting and protection. Yet here they were, left behind. Kayaks and sleds remained in their usual places. Supplies were stacked neatly. Personal belongings, clothing, tools, crafts were undisturbed. Everything you would expect to find in a working village was there. Except the people. LaBelle searched every dwelling, calling out, hoping to find someone who could explain what had happened. The village could house about 30 people, and he found evidence that all of them had been there recently, very recently. But now, every single person was gone. Then he made a discovery that chilled him even more than the Arctic wind. The dogs. Inuit sled dogs were incredibly hardy animals, bred for survival in extreme conditions. They could withstand temperatures and hardships that would kill other breeds. But here, at the edge of the village, LaBelle found the dogs tied to their posts, all of them dead, apparently starved and frozen. This made no sense. The Inuit treated their dogs like family, like essential partners in survival. They would never abandon them tied up with no food or shelter. If the villagers had left voluntarily, they would have either taken the dogs or released them to fend for themselves. Leaving them tied up to die was unthinkable. LaBelle's mind raced. Had there been an attack, a disease, some kind of mass evacuation. But there were no signs of violence, no blood, no bodies. There were no tracks leading away from the village, and in the fresh snow, any group of 30 people would have left obvious trails. As darkness fell, LaBelle spent a terrifying night alone in the ghost village, huddled in one of the dwellings with his rifle across his lap. Every creak, every gust of wind made him jump. He felt like he was being watched, though he never saw anyone. At first light, he left as fast as his legs could carry him. LaBelle snowshoed and sledded for days until he reached the nearest Royal Canadian Mounted Police outpost. He burst in, wild-eyed and exhausted, and told his story to the officers on duty. The Mounties were skeptical at first. LaBelle was known to be reliable, but the story seemed impossible. An entire village doesn't just disappear. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the villagers had moved to another location for seasonal hunting, or perhaps LaBelle had made a mistake about which village he'd visited. But LaBelle was insistent. He knew that village. He'd been there many times, and he knew something terrible had happened. The RCMP organized an expedition. In the dead of winter, travel was dangerous and slow, but they had to investigate. A group of officers, accompanied by LaBelle and some local guides, made the long trek back to Anjikuni Lake. When they arrived, they found the village exactly as LaBelle had described it: silent, empty, abandoned. The Mounties conducted a thorough search. They documented everything they found, interviewed LaBelle in detail, and searched for any clues that might explain the disappearance. What they found only deepened the mystery. In one of the dwellings, they found a pot of stew still hanging over a fire pit. The stew had long since gone cold, but had clearly been cooking when the fire was last tended. Nearby, they found sewing projects left mid-stitch, tools left mid-use, as if the villagers had simply stopped what they were doing and walked away in the middle of their daily routines. Rifles leaned against doorways. An Inuit hunter would never abandon his rifle. It was his lifeline in the wilderness, essential for hunting and protection. Yet here they were, left behind. Kayaks and sleds remained in their usual places. Supplies were stacked neatly. Personal belongings, clothing, tools, crafts were undisturbed. Everything, except the people. LaBelle searched every dwelling, calling out, hoping to find someone who could explain what had happened. The village could house about 30 people, and he found evidence that all of them had been there recently, very recently. But now, every single person was gone. Then he made a discovery that chilled him even more than the Arctic wind. The dogs. Inuit sled dogs were incredibly hardy animals, bred for survival in extreme conditions. They could withstand temperatures and hardships that would kill other breeds. But here, at the edge of the village, LaBelle found the dogs tied to their posts, all of them dead, apparently starved and frozen. This made no sense. The Inuit treated their dogs like family, like essential partners in survival. They would never abandon them tied up with no food or shelter. If the villagers had left voluntarily, they would have either taken the dogs or released them to fend for themselves. Leaving them tied up to die was unthinkable. LaBelle's mind raced. Had there been an attack, a disease, some kind of mass evacuation? But there were no signs of violence, no blood, no bodies. There were no tracks leading away from the village, and in the fresh snow, any group of 30 people would have left obvious trails. As darkness fell, LaBelle spent a terrifying night alone in the ghost village, huddled in one of the dwellings with his rifle across his lap. Every creak, every gust of wind made him jump. He felt like he was being watched, though he never saw anyone. At first light, he left as fast as his legs could carry him. LaBelle snowshoed and sledded for days until he reached the nearest Royal Canadian Mounted Police outpost. He burst in, wild-eyed and exhausted, and told his story to the officers on duty. The Mounties were skeptical at first. LaBelle was known to be reliable, but the story seemed impossible. An entire village doesn't just disappear. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the villagers had moved to another location for seasonal hunting, or perhaps LaBelle had made a mistake about which village he'd visited. But LaBelle was insistent. He knew that village. He'd been there many times, and he knew something terrible had happened. The RCMP organized an expedition. In the dead of winter, travel was dangerous and slow, but they had to investigate. A group of officers, accompanied by LaBelle and some local guides, made the long trek back to Anjikuni Lake. When they arrived, they found the village exactly as LaBelle had described it: silent, empty, abandoned. The Mounties conducted a thorough search. They documented everything they found, interviewed LaBelle in detail, and searched for any clues that might explain the disappearance. What they discovered only deepened the mystery. In one of the dwellings, they found a pot of stew still hanging over a fire pit. The stew had long since gone cold, but it had clearly been cooking when the fire was last tended. Nearby, they found sewing projects left mid-stitch, tools left mid-use, as if the villagers had simply stopped what they were doing and walked away in the middle of their daily routines. The grave site near the village had been disturbed. In Inuit tradition, the dead were buried with stones piled over them to protect the bodies from scavengers. Someone, or something, had removed the stones from several graves, though the bodies themselves were apparently missing. This was deeply disturbing. The Inuit held their dead in reverence. They would never disturb graves, and the idea that the missing villagers would do so before they left made no sense. The Mounties searched for tracks, for any sign of where the villagers had gone. In the snow and ice of the Arctic, tracks last for days or even weeks. A group of 30 people, including children, moving across the tundra would leave unmistakable evidence: footprints, sled tracks, signs of travel. They found nothing. Not a single footprint leading away from the village. This was perhaps the most baffling aspect of the whole case. How do 30 people leave a village without leaving tracks? Even if a snowstorm had covered some tracks, there should have been some evidence near the village, under sheltered areas, or on ice where the wind couldn't reach. The RCMP expanded their search. They contacted other Inuit communities in the region, sent out search parties, and put out bulletins asking for any information about the missing villagers. Surely someone had seen them. Surely they had turned up somewhere. Days turned into weeks. No one had seen the villagers. No other community reported 30 new arrivals. No bodies were found. No evidence of an attack, a disease outbreak, or any other catastrophe emerged. One particularly strange report came from a trapper named Armand Laurent, who claimed he had seen a strange light in the sky over Anjikuni Lake around the time the village disappeared. He described it as a bright, glowing object that moved in ways no aircraft could, hovering and darting across the night sky before shooting away at impossible speed. This claim was met with skepticism by most people, but it added another layer of strangeness to an already inexplicable case. In 1930, UFO sightings weren't part of popular culture the way they would become in later decades, so Laurent's report was particularly unusual for its time. The RCMP investigation eventually stalled. Without evidence of a crime, without bodies, and without witnesses, there was nothing to pursue. The case remained open but inactive. The official position was that the villagers had likely moved to another location, and Labelle had somehow been mistaken about the state of the village. But Labelle never wavered. Until his death, he maintained that he had found that village exactly as he described it: abandoned, eerie, and inexplicable. Over the decades, the Anjikuni Lake disappearance has spawned dozens of theories, ranging from the mundane to the fantastical. The truth is, we may never know what really happened. But examining the possibilities reveals just how strange this case truly is. Theory 1. Mass migration. The most skeptical explanation is that there was no mystery at all. According to this theory, Labelle either misremembered what he saw, exaggerated his story, or visited the village at a time when the inhabitants were temporarily away. Inuit communities in the 1930s were semi-nomadic. They would sometimes relocate temporarily to follow game, visit other communities, or travel to trading posts. It's possible that the entire village had left together for hunting or social reasons, and Labelle happened to arrive during their absence. This theory explains the basic facts: no people, possessions left behind, no signs of violence. But it struggles with several details. First, why were the dogs left tied up to starve? Even in a temporary absence, the Inuit would have either brought their dogs or released them. Second, why were rifles left behind? These were essential tools, not the kind of thing you'd forget when leaving for a hunting trip. Third, why were fires still burning and food left out as if people had been interrupted mid-meal? And most critically, if this was a simple case of a temporarily empty village, why did the RCMP never find the villagers? Why did no other community report their arrival? 30 people don't just disappear into the Canadian wilderness without someone noticing. Theory 2. Disease outbreak. Another mundane explanation is that the village was struck by a sudden deadly disease. Perhaps a flu, smallpox, or other illness swept through the community. Panicked and watching their loved ones die, the survivors might have fled, hoping to escape the contagion. In their panic, they might have left behind possessions in their haste. Perhaps they were too disoriented or frightened to think clearly about taking supplies or weapons. This theory has some historical precedent. Disease outbreaks could devastate isolated indigenous communities, especially when introduced diseases like influenza or measles arrived from contact with European traders. Entire villages had been wiped out by epidemics in the past. However, this theory has major problems. First, no bodies were found in the village. If people had died from disease, where were they? Second, if survivors had fled, they would have left tracks. A panicked group running from disease would leave obvious evidence of their flight. Third, the disturbed graves don't fit this theory at all. Moreover, if there had been a disease outbreak, the RCMP would have likely found some evidence: reports from other communities, sick travelers showing up elsewhere, or bodies along a trail. They found none of these things. Theory 3. Starvation and desperation. Some researchers have suggested that the village faced a food crisis. Perhaps the hunting had been poor that season, fish stocks were depleted, and the community was starving. In desperation, the villagers might have left together to seek food or help, knowing they faced death if they stayed. This could explain why they left so suddenly and why rifles were abandoned. Perhaps they were too weak to carry everything. The dead dogs could be explained by the same food shortage that affected the people. But again, the lack of tracks is the insurmountable problem. A group of starving people moving across the tundra would move slowly and would definitely leave evidence of their passage. They would also likely have split up, with stronger members going for help while others stayed behind. An entire community traveling together while starving is unlikely. Additionally, if they were starving, why was their food cooking on stoves? Why were meals left half-eaten? The evidence suggests the villagers had food. They weren't eating it out of desperation. Theory 4. Attack by outsiders. Could the village have been attacked? Perhaps by hostile outsiders, another group, criminals, or even rogue traders. In this scenario, attackers could have kidnapped the villagers, perhaps to force them into labor or to eliminate them as competitors in the fur trade. The attackers might have cleaned up evidence, removed bodies, and deliberately left the village looking untouched to confuse investigators. This is one of the more plausible theories, as it explains both the disappearance and the lack of tracks. The attackers could have covered their tracks deliberately or used the lake ice where tracks wouldn't show. However, it requires a massive, well-organized operation. Kidnapping 30 people, including children and elders, across Arctic terrain would be enormously difficult. Why would anyone undertake such a risky operation? What would they gain? And how did they do it without anyone escaping or fighting back hard enough to leave evidence? The Inuit were not helpless people. They were skilled hunters and survivors. An attack on the village should have left signs of struggle, blood, disturbed snow, broken items. The scene was too neat, too undisturbed. Theory 6. Government conspiracy. Some conspiracy theorists have suggested that the Canadian government or military conducted secret operations in the Arctic, possibly testing weapons or relocating indigenous people as part of Cold War-era programs. According to this theory, the villagers were forcibly relocated or eliminated as part of a classified program, and the scene was staged to look like a mysterious disappearance. The RCMP investigation was then either incompetent or deliberately misleading. There is some historical truth to the fact that Indigenous peoples in Canada were sometimes relocated by government policy in the 20th century. However, these relocations were documented, not secret, and certainly didn't involve making entire villages disappear without a trace. This theory requires believing in an extremely competent cover-up involving multiple agencies maintaining perfect secrecy for nearly a century. It's possible, but not particularly likely. Given the 1930s timing and Armand Laurent's report of strange lights in the sky, some people have inevitably suggested that the villagers were abducted by aliens. According to this theory, an extraterrestrial craft appeared over the village, somehow compelled or transported all the villagers aboard, and left no evidence behind because the technology was so advanced that it didn't require the people to physically walk to a location. They were simply taken. This would explain the lack of tracks, the suddenness of the disappearance, the fact that meals and fires were left as if people vanished mid-activity, and the strange lights reported in the sky. Of course, this theory requires accepting that extraterrestrial life not only exists, but is actively abducting humans from Earth. There's no physical evidence for this, and it raises more questions than it answers. Why this village? What happened to the people afterward? Why has no similar mass abduction been documented before or since? That said, for believers in UFO phenomena, Anjikuni Lake remains one of the most compelling cases in their catalog. Theory 8. The story is exaggerated or false. The final theory, and the one that many historians and skeptics favor, is that the Anjikuni Lake disappearance never happened as described, or didn't happen at all. Joe LaBelle was a real person, but there's no contemporary documentation of his report to the RCMP. The earliest written accounts of the story appear in newspapers and books from the 1950s and later, decades after the supposed event. Some researchers have found no official RCMP records of an investigation into a missing Inuit village in 1930. There are no records of 30 missing Inuit people from that region during that time period. No Inuit oral histories or community records mention this event. It's possible that LaBelle told a story that grew in the retelling, or that a writer embellished a smaller incident into a grand mystery. Stories about mysterious disappearances and paranormal events in the Canadian wilderness were popular in pulp magazines and books of the era. This theory suggests that Anjikuni Lake is an urban legend, a compelling story that never actually happened, or didn't happen the way it's been told. However, even if we accept this skeptical view, we're left with the question, why did this particular story capture people's imaginations so powerfully? What about it resonates enough that it's been retold, investigated, and debated for nearly a century? In recent decades, researchers have attempted to verify or debunk the Anjikuni Lake story using modern tools and historical research. The challenges are significant. In 1930, record-keeping in remote Canadian territories was sparse. Many Inuit communities had minimal contact with government authorities and weren't consistently documented in official records. The RCMP was stretched thin across vast territories, and not every investigation was thoroughly documented. Researchers have searched RCMP archives for any mention of the case. Some claim to have found references to an investigation into a missing Inuit community near Anjikuni Lake, though the records are fragmentary and unclear. Others have found nothing at all, suggesting the story might be apocryphal. Attempts to locate surviving relatives of Joe LaBelle have been partially successful. Some family members confirmed that LaBelle told stories about strange experiences in the North, though details vary in the retelling. No one has produced a written account from LaBelle himself, and he died long before the story became widely known. Archaeologists and anthropologists have visited the Anjikuni Lake area, searching for evidence of abandoned villages from the early 20th century. The region has been inhabited by Inuit peoples for thousands of years, and there are indeed abandoned settlement sites throughout the area. However, determining which sites were occupied in 1930 and which might correspond to LaBelle's story has proven difficult. The harsh Arctic environment doesn't preserve evidence well. Wooden structures decay, artifacts are scattered by wind and animals, and the constant freeze-thaw cycles destroy what's left. One research team claimed to have found a site matching the description of the village, partially collapsed structures arranged in a circle near a lake, with what appeared to be grave markers. However, they found no evidence of a sudden abandonment or mysterious circumstances. The site appeared to be a typical seasonal settlement that was gradually abandoned over time as residents moved to larger communities or trading posts. Inuit communities in the region have been consulted about the story. Most have no oral traditions or memories of a mass disappearance in 1930. Some elders remember hearing the story as children, but always as something that happened somewhere else, or long ago, not as a documented event in their community's history. This is significant because Inuit oral tradition is generally very reliable. Important events, deaths, disasters, notable hunts, encounters with outsiders are remembered and passed down through generations. The absence of this story in Inuit oral history suggests it may not have happened as described, or may have happened to a different community that was later conflated with Anjikuni Lake. Some researchers have suggested that the story might be a conflation of several different events, a village that relocated voluntarily, combined with stories of disease outbreaks, mixed with frontier tales and exaggerations, all compressed into one dramatic narrative. In this interpretation, Joe LaBelle might have encountered an empty village at some point. Perhaps the residents were temporarily away hunting or visiting another community. He might have found the scene unusual or unsettling. Later, when retelling the story, either LaBelle himself or subsequent writers added dramatic elements: the burning fires, the dead dogs, the disturbed graves, the strange lights in the sky.
Each retelling added new details, and eventually, what might have been a mildly interesting anecdote became a legendary unsolved mystery. This process of story evolution is well documented in folklore studies. Dramatic stories with mysterious elements naturally accumulate details over time as different tellers add elements that make the story more compelling or frightening. So, what really happened at Anjikuni Lake in November 1930? The honest answer is, we don't know, and we may never know. If the story is true as told, then it represents one of the most inexplicable mass disappearances in history. 30 people vanished without leaving any trace, their fate unknown to this day. No remains have ever been found. No survivors have ever come forward. The mystery remains complete and unsolved. If the story is exaggerated or apocryphal, it tells us something equally interesting about human nature. Our fascination with the mysterious, the unexplained, the frightening. We want to believe that there are still places in the world where strange things happen, where the ordinary rules don't apply, where mysteries remain unsolved. The Canadian Arctic in the 1930s was one of the last truly remote frontiers. It was a place where people lived in ways that had changed little for thousands of years, where nature was harsh and unforgiving, where isolation was complete. It's a perfect setting for a mystery. Perhaps that's why the Anjikuni Lake story has endured. Whether true, exaggerated, or completely invented, it captures something essential about the human experience of wilderness and the unknown. What we can say for certain is that the story has had real impacts. It's influenced how we think about remote communities and the importance of communication and contact with isolated groups. It's inspired countless works of fiction, from horror stories to X-Files episodes. It's become part of Canadian folklore, a ghost story told around campfires and in classrooms. For believers, Anjikuni Lake stands as proof that the world still holds genuine mysteries, phenomena that science and reason cannot explain. It's evidence that we don't have all the answers, that there are still gaps in our knowledge. For skeptics, it's a cautionary tale about how stories evolve, how anecdotes become legends, and how we should approach extraordinary claims with critical thinking and demand for evidence.
The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Something likely happened in the Canadian Arctic that caught Joe LaBelle's attention. Whether it was as dramatic as the legend suggests, we'll probably never know. The village at Anjikuni Lake, if it ever existed as described, is long gone now. The Arctic has reclaimed whatever evidence might have been there. The people who might have known the truth have passed away. All that remains is the story itself. And perhaps that's enough. The mystery of Anjikuni Lake reminds us that the world is larger and stranger than we often acknowledge. It challenges us to wonder, what else has happened in remote places that we'll never know about? How many mysteries remain hidden in the wilderness, waiting to be discovered, or remaining forever lost? Joe LaBelle walked into a silent village and found a mystery. We're still trying to solve it nearly a century later. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly how some mysteries are meant to be. Unsolved, unexplained, forever haunting our imagination.